All right, welcome to a new episode of Cali Claptrap Integral Conversations. Today's guest is Jeremy Johnson. Jeremy, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Good to be here, Matt. Nice
Awesome.
to catch up.
Yes, definitely. So Jeremy is the author of Seeing Through the World, Gebser and Integral Consciousness, and also he is president of the Gebser Society. Jeremy, what I'd like to kind of start off with is at what age did you write Seeing Through the World? Do you remember?
Oh gosh, I guess 32 now, right?
Okay.
So it's like
Okay.
2019. Yeah.
Nice. So for those of you who have not read Seen Through the World, it's a beautiful book, by the way. And I
Thanks.
consider it an essential piece to any integral library and a true tour de force. And I was hoping, Jeremy, you could talk just a little bit about how long did it take you to write this, the process, because there's so much in here in so little pages, but it's so compacted and I just was curious about the process that you took to write this.
Yeah, sure. So it didn't take that long to write. I mean, it is a
I'm
short
jealous.
book. It is a short book. But it's a dense book, as you're mentioning. There's a lot packed in there. But
Mhm.
I basically started it. Oh, I don't know. I guess it was 2018, late 2018, since it was published in early 2019. So I would say summer of 2018, I was working on the book, and basically it started with, first of all, my publisher, co-editor Jen Zart was like, "When are you going to write a Gebser book? There just needs to be another Gebser book out there. There's not a lot of material, so like make that your first book." She was very helpful in just sort of nudging me to do it. And basically, I just started to outline it in the months coming up to that summer. Nothing very like writing heavy, just sort of like getting a sense of what I wanted to talk about. I think I hosted the first Gepser course. I was doing some Gepser online teaching. So it was all fresh. It was all fresh in the mind. And basically, what happened was in the summer, and I always talk about this because it was when I found the book cover um, by Nina Bunjevic. That's the artist who did the Gepser picture. I it was like a late thunderstorm, like a kind of a sunny afternoon sun shower in Florida, a lot of thunder in the background. And I was just like, you know what? I'm gonna give the opening chapter a go and just like to see what I wanted to write about and just like completely stream of consciousness write. And what came out was basically that opening chapter. Uh, Obviously, it was revised and edited a little bit, but that came out all at once. And then that same afternoon, I found the Nina Bunjevic picture. I reached out to her. She's like, "You're working on a book? Oh, I'd love to collaborate with that." Um, so all of it just sort of started to come together. And then basically from basically August on through January of 2019, I was doing revisions and editing. So it was a couple of months of intensive writing where it was just my routine, like get up, go to the coffee shop or write at home. And it was kind of restless. Like I would have like a flow here in the apartment, and then I would go to a coffee shop, then I would go to another coffee shop. So it was just this like kind of wrestling with the book in a very short, condensed period of time. But the good
Mm.
thing is I think I didn't really, with a book like that, all of the topics, all of the associations and connections I had in that book, it was all kind of percolating and already sitting inside of me, right? Like
Mhm.
outlining Gepser, connecting him to, contemporary relevant issues. Like those are all things in sort of like a precursory way that the book does. We're all kind of sitting inside already. They just needed to
Yeah.
kind of come out. So in a way,
Right.
it was like an exorcism.
Yeah.
It was just getting this book out of me,
Yeah.
that was ready to be written. So
So it
yeah,
was it was birthed under thunder and lightning and had a lot of synchronicity, and that's an amazing story. It was nice to hear that. One of the excerpts I wanted to read, because it's probably impossible to cover, how you said it was dense, the complexity of Gebser, but I thought this passage was really well, and I thought we could kind of start off with this. So Gebser, this is from page 172. Gebser offers us a way of thinking about the present that is difficult to disagree with in any of its major points. The structures of consciousness are palpable realities that can be recognized by the careful reader in a concrete way. The Janus-faced interim age between the mental and the integral inform us on our current crisis between technology and the biosphere, capitalism, and a future means of distributive and immanent Gaian politics. And you go on to say there that, and I think that really segues nice between sort of, it feels like we're teeter-tottering between, obviously there's crises going on every time you wake up in the morning. And so you kind of feel like there's this pull happening. And so where I think your work is so essential, I think for most people that are just curious about what is going on in the world, how can we define kind of what's happening, you really present a really good explanation as far as how we got here and perhaps where are we trying to go. And you also mentioned a little bit about that homo faber is being replaced by homo integer, and I had to look up homo faber, and the definition I got here, that the concept that human beings are able to control their fate and their environment as a result of the use of tools. And so I was hoping maybe you could just, obviously that's beautifully summarized in itself, but reflecting on today's age, how do you, with the knowledge of Gebser and the integral consciousness, how can you look, as you say, see through the world to help us as far as understand what is going on right now?
Yeah, good question, and difficult to summarize as well, right?
Yeah.
What is going on right now, especially since like even our last couple of growing down podcasts, like so much has happened in current events that it would take a lot of time to unpack. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't think anything that I wrote in that book in 2019 is necessarily not related or not helpful in terms of like understanding the broad brush strokes of, the crisis that we're in. So I would say probably first of all, and I agree with Gebser about this, that we're really dealing with a form of what they say in our consciousness community, sense making, forms of ontology, like our relationship with being, what is being, how we relate to the world in this very fundamental way is breaking down. So our identity, our relationship with time, our construction of our self perception and community perception, all this is breaking down and becoming deeply atomized. And Gebser was really talking about that back in 1949. Is like, okay, let's look at these in his phenomenology. Let's look at these structures of consciousness, how they led to this point of atomization and breakdown. Then also kind of look at the latent or incipient new forms of consciousness that maybe are doing something different, whether you see it as the next stage or you see it as something completely kind of coming out of the blue, orthogonal to what we've been doing. There is this new way of seeing, relating, and being in the world that is latent in human beings. And this is something Gebser is really kind of trying to point out through his very careful and meticulous study of art and culture and language and contemporary poetry and new science, etc. When he came up with those integral oriented themes, which you and I are familiar with, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But I think fundamentally it has to do with a new relationship with time. Uh, Time not as sort of a linear time, but a sort of a multi-dimensional, manifold kind of time. It's actually the easier metaphor is thinking of time as we kind of have to spatialize it a little bit in order to kind of grasp this, but the manifold and the fold, I think, is a really good example. And I don't really talk about that in the book. I've been doing that more often lately,
Mm-hmm.
talking about the concept of the fold to explore multidimensionality and time.
Right.
But there's this folding and unfolding process, which is processual, which is, this capacity to be cognizant perhaps of more than one dimension
Mm-hmm.
simultaneously.
Yeah.
I think is really important. And this sort of dovetails in with other thinkers like Edgar Morin and complexity science, of course, and planetary thinking that he talks about, or Wilbur, right, and sort of the flex flow and vision logic. So there's a kind of thinking and being in the world that is coming online. It's just very nascent. It's very
Mm-hmm.
undeveloped at the moment. But the idea is to kind of tease out the threads where it is emerging so we can really lean into those, right? And that's the
Yeah.
orientation I think with my book is like really identifying where atomization and breakdown is happening and tracing that to a structure of consciousness, and then also
Mm-hmm.
simultaneously really identifying where this new integral structure is coming online, so you can lean into it and really embolden it and strengthen it and mature it, right?
Yeah.
And become aware of it. So
Right.
that's sort of the process of the book.
Yeah, and so for our listeners here, you also said in the book, time freedom is, or maybe it was this was actually a Gebser quote. Time freedom is the conscious form of the archaic, And another
Mm.
way I think of integral, perhaps maybe the easiest way, and tell me if this is too simple, is it's sort of a spiritual grasping of the whole, and
Mhm.
not to define it too much, but overall, it's like a spiritual validation that sort of supersedes the mental.
Mhm. No,
So,
that's a good definition. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, I would say this is something I've talked a lot about recently, a felt sense of the whole, that, like,
Hmm.
it's not necessarily, uh, predominantly rational, or it isn't we don't achieve it or reach it through our reason or through our logic, but there is this felt sense, a palpable felt sense of the whole
Right.
that we begin to work with more. And
Yeah.
through our reason, through our logic, through our art, through just our cultural phenomenology, we're responding to the sense of wholeness.
Hmm.
And that gets into tricky territory, because what do we mean by wholeness, of course, right? And then
Right. Right.
is it the sum of parts, or is it inexhaustible, is it kind of a singularity in the sense of it's being irreducible and it's inexhaustible? And I tend to lean towards the latter, right? That the
Hmm.
concepts don't really ever grasp it. But yeah, it goes into spiritual territory, and I don't think
Yeah.
that's really avoidable, you know?
Right.
So
Yeah. And in the end, you kind of talked about Gebser's own, or at least how Suzuki described it, his Satori moment. But it is sort of an awakening that, the mental has been exhausted, and this is, we've gotten to as much as we can from this structure, and sort of, and what's next, right? And one of the other excerpts I really wanted to talk to you about, because you are involved with sort of what's considered leftist politics, but something maybe I was unaware of, at least until I reread your book, was about a little bit about how Gepser kind of talks about the left. And so I wanted to discuss this excerpt here. So just as the machine, and they're talking about the steam machine, right? Watts, I believe, was or maybe machine in general, was emancipated from its maker. The left awakened into Western consciousness through the French Revolution, which first began in 1789, not long after the invention of the steam engine. Gebser connects these two historical events as expressing the same mutational quality. The left, as we mentioned, has hitherto in Western culture been the subject of repression and denial by the very prejudice of the mental's wakeful consciousness. The resurgence of everything that has been regarded as left, whether they are repressed individuals and cultures, women in patriarchy, human beings in the biosphere, in industrial capitalism, or even and especially altered states of consciousness, all comes roaring back in an uncontrolled intensity, demanding our attention. And then goes on to say that for the left, it is the individual standing in for the whole that seeks their freedom. And he sort of
mhm,
talked about this emancipatory quality of you can almost see through this passage too, that those whose voices have been silenced, whose power have been repressed, can be silenced and repressed no more. And you feel sort of that push coming through. And I
mhm,
think right now what you see with so many uprisings, whether that be on the left or the right, is this push that's sort of happening. And so being involved with leftist politics, and you've been involved with the late Michael Brooks on his show, and I was curious on how you tie in sort of both sort of, and he was a big advocate for integral, and somehow getting integral more entwined with the left. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about when you read this, is that more, and your involvement with leftist politics, is that come from Gepser, or do you think it just comes from simultaneous sort of being involved with leftist politics, but also being interested in Gepser?
yeah, good question. For me, I think before I was reading Gebser, I was interested in the left and leftist politics.
Mm-hmm.
So that's definitely partly my own disposition. But in reading Gebser as a leftist, I think things get very interesting, because he himself is very often talking about it's not about the left or the right. He's not really about the center either. He's saying, this transcends any kind of polarity, which is
Mm-hmm.
interesting.
Yeah.
Um, while also acknowledging, like, the eruption of the left as a kind of a political force, or kind of a cultural tradition now, since it's been around for a few hundred years, 200 or so
Mm-hmm.
years. Like, it's also this yearning for integration. It's this eruption of something that needs to be reintegrated. And throughout EPO, Gebser's talking about the supersession of patriarchy being one of the qualities of integral consciousness, right? So he is talking about things that the left is talking about. Now, what he might be doing, and he wasn't leaning into political discourse too much, um, but what he is doing is sort of leaving room, I think, for the left to begin to explore, okay, what does freedom mean in this context, like without patriarchy or matriarchy, right? Because that's what he's talking about in terms of, when we supersede patriarchy, we don't want to just swing into matriarchy. We want to
Mm-hmm.
find some other way of being whole, being human. And I think for the most part, beyond the kind of partisanship or particular dogmatism of a particular political ideology, even ones that are meant to be liberating, like I don't know if you're a dogmatic communist or a dogmatic anarchist or something along those lines, I don't think he would advocate for that. But traditionally or generally, I could say the left stands in for this sense of freedom, right? Integrating wholeness. Something has been repressed or disintegrated, and so there's some kind of integrative and remedial process that needs to take place in society. So that's how I kind of bring them together. But I think,
Mm-hmm.
the other interesting element, which was, it's still prefigurative, but it's something that Michael Brooks is very interested in because he kind of was raised reading Wilbur, and he was very interested in Wilbur's complexity thinking, and he read Thompson. He started to read Gebser when we were talking. And I think, and I'm not, putting words in his mouth exactly, but I think he was really interested in creating a situation where leftist organizers were reading integral theory and learning how to become complex thinkers, right? So that
Mm-hmm.
they didn't become entrenched in a particular ideological position, so that they could really kind of account for all the different dimensions and variables that need to be accounted for, right? In
Right.
terms of, if we're looking to transform society, then we really need an integral approach, because we need to look at all of the different dimensions, like the subjective, the intersubjective, the objective, right? The economic, the spiritual, all of it
Mm-hmm.
has to be held. So I think that's sort of where, and this is what I agree with in terms of the project on the left. It would be great for the left to take up an integral oriented style of thinking, right?
Mm-hmm.
Education, thinking, training, to just help, assess the situation better, right? Because if we're only looking at the economic or the material, um, and almost downplaying the necessity of understanding the spiritual, that's a big problem, right? And
Right.
obviously, Gebser's vision of integrality is one that is both deeply material and embodied, and then also capable of rendering present the immaterial, the spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Wilbur and Gebser, in that sense, are very similar because they're both advocating for the wholeness of being.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, and for our listeners who don't know, EPO is ever present origin. That's sort of Gebser's main book.
mhm.
Um, and so one of the things that that's a great summary and to sort of lead me into the next question, because one of my attempts to sort of be involved with the integral community was to try to understand in present sort of, are these different parties talking to each other? What authors are out there that I'm unaware of? And you've done a great job of sort of, I mean, just through your book of sort of sharing, it's really up to date, who you think is relevant to what's significant in today's age. But something I keep going back to, and it almost seems like something, a conflict a little bit in the integral community and Wilbur, is this idea of the participatory cosmos. And so, one of the things I know I was taught sort of growing up was never go to a party and discuss politics and religion. But now in today's age, that's sort of our most interesting topics, right? So,
Yeah.
you have sort of the eco-social political meets the spiritual, right? And so I was hoping maybe you can give a little bit about how you understand the participatory cosmos and why it's relevant to an integral community.
Sure. Yeah. Good. Big topic.
Yeah.
I really, and I mentioned this in the book in just a footnote, but I'd love to unpack it further at some point. But Jorge Ferrer's work
Hmm.
on participatory spirituality, I think, is really important, and it's specific to the transpersonal field in terms of transpersonal studies. But I think its relevance, the methodology he developed, is really kind of relevant to integral theory as a whole, because he's really taking um, many kind of concepts, just in terms of what it means to be participatory. I think it's very, very contemporary and very aperspectival in the way Gepser talks about, because there's a sense in which our agency is involved in our perception. They're intimate with each other, and that might be present in Wilbur to some degree, um,
Hmm.
or to a large degree, of course. But the way he describes religion or the religious experience as a kind of a like an endless shore of the ocean and the
Mm-hmm.
land kind of meeting, right? There's no kind of finitude in it. That kind of mediational participatory space between our culture and the world, or our culture and the transcendent, is really, I think, where Ferrer gets it really well. And I think that's also a sense, Ferrer is articulating an element of Gebser's integral spirituality that Gebser just hints at in Ever Present Origin and elsewhere. So we can talk about it in that sense. I think another element of the participatory cosmos is the foundation of Gebser's work. The too long didn't read, right, is like he talks about ever present origin. Origin is this sort of originary consciousness, but for Gebser, we're always participating in origin, and origin's always participating in us, right? So the structures of consciousness are something, or aspects of us that we are co-making with origin, right? Our individuality is something we're co-making with origin. So we're always in this participatory creative process with the whole. And so I
Right.
think part of what it means to be homo integer is this capacity to consciously be working almost like an artist, in that sense of working with the whole, always understanding and recognizing that participation in transparency, right? We're transparent to our participation in origin and its participation in us, or the
Right.
spiritual in us.
Mm-hmm.
So again, yeah, it's a very beautiful participatory vision. um, and in that sense, you could extend it. You mentioned cosmology. We could extend it to like I forget the author's name who came up with the cosmotheandry, in the sense of like the whole cosmos is participatory and creative. I mean, we could
Mm-hmm.
extend it to evolution and life and agency and consciousness. We could
Yeah.
really push it into an entire cosmological vision of spiritual participation and creativity. And I tend
Mm-hmm.
to. I mean, and that's sort of like, if we move into the cosmological, I would certainly say, seeing the cosmos as an evolutionary, creative, and participatory process is definitely how I see it. And I think, to a great degree is how Gebser saw it. But he kind of pointed the way to looking at Sri Aurobindo for that, and to
Mm.
looking at Teilhard de Chardin for that as well, because he looked at
Mm-hmm.
them as sort of co-conspirators of this integral consciousness and articulating it in their own way. And I would say Teilhard is much more really kind of trying to unpack the cosmological. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, I know, yeah, something that I know I'm reading, I've read, I've just gotten done with a couple of Ferrer books, but also it seemed in there, Richard Tarnas seems to be a big originator of the sort of idea of this participatory cosmos. And I haven't read, I think it's Cosmos and Psyche yet, but I am looking forward to
yeah,
kind of, again, it's what's so interesting about these authors that you write is that they all seem to be connected, and including you in this, is connecting to this idea that really seems to be on the edge of humanity and where we're going. And so, one of my questions was, how can we aid in this transition to a Homo integer?
yeah. Great question. There are so many ways to respond to that question right now, right? Like basic material level. This is what I've been interested in, with my Patreon community and some of the folks in the integral community. Is like, okay, how do we make this regenerative turn, right? Because if this transformation is going to occur, I think those of us in the integral community are very good at exploring interior states and states of consciousness and practices of like the we space and that kind of stuff. And I have no problem with any of that. I think we
Mm-hmm.
just need a way for this to translate into our material historical
Mm-hmm.
process, right? So that means looking at, if you're not going to be a theorist about it, then looking at ways you can get involved and practice, some form of participatory culture, economics, commons. There's common
Mm-hmm.
studies and peer-to-peer studies that are going on about how to get involved in like local cooperatives, or local food commons. I think this is the direction that our world is turning towards, just after centuries of extractive economics and now this climate crisis. So at a very
Mm-hmm.
material level, I think the regenerative and the local, and emphasizing those practices, rediscovering community, um, these are going to be really, really important for the coming generations, and it starts with us. So I think in that little way, in that little material way, we can get involved. But
Yeah.
maybe in like a personal way, this is probably true for most spiritual traditions on paper. But I think Gebser often talked about how, you know becoming integral or learning to be integral is in a certain sense overcoming your ego. And that's
Mm,
easier said than done. But
yeah.
I think becoming aware of yourself and the kind of the contours of yourself and your own shadow is important. And the integral folks are very interested in doing that too, right?
Right.
So that's the kind of the personal practice, which is a spiritual practice of overcoming yourself. Um, and then another element, which is sort of the Gebserian leaning in, might be this is something that I've been advocating with my students, really emphasizing uh, bringing these earlier structures of consciousness either online or recognizing how they're already kind of playing a part in our day-to-day living. So there's many different ways to kind of do that, but obviously in a short podcast we can't unpack
Right.
all the different structures of consciousness, but the
Yeah.
archaic, the magic, the mythic, really
Mm-hmm.
seeing how we live those day to day,
Mm-hmm.
in the kind of minutia, and just seeing how we don't need to practice that fluidity because we're already fluidly moving between them. But then when we start to practice it and really kind of, okay, what is the magic, what is the mythic, how am I employing the mental, they become concretized. And I talk about that in the book, how really concretizing these structures and fluidly being able to kind of observe them as they are interrelated as one whole and a daily practice. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's really a way to, if we were going to actively do something at a psycho-spiritual level, that's really a way, to, I think, to intensify these structures, to really bring forward that integrality, that innate
Yeah.
integrality. Easier said than done, but
Right.
that's where it gets fun. And I think,
Yeah.
in terms of a psycho-spiritual practice, it gets kind of interesting. Like you mentioned Tarnas in the
Mm-hmm.
participatory cosmos, like he's talking a lot about that mythical sense of the archetypal cosmos, which by its definition involves every single person because of their particular birth chart, right? Their astrological birth chart and their natal positioning, and then what's going on in the cosmos with these archetypes that are influencing us as individuals. So we're always involved in that sense, right? We're always participating in that sense. And that's
Right.
really good to find a way to not accept it exactly as sort of a suspension of disbelief, but really kind of get into it in a way that like it becomes alive for us. And Tarnis might not be it,
Right.
astrology may not be it, but myths and myth making, there's so many ways to kind of bring that online and make it active again. So
Mm-hmm.
there's
Yeah.
a
One of
path in all this. Yeah.
Right, definitely, and that's kind of where I'm trying to sniff out where that is.
Yeah.
And something that I really got from EPO was, the movement from this exclusive validity of the mental to the exclusive validity of the integral, and it's impossible to not talk about the spiritual and the sacredness. And right now, you kind of see in this world, sort of. In addition to extracting material, you almost see the extraction of the sacred. You almost
Hmm.
lose. I mean, just with the most recent Capitol uprising, is where's the sacredness of this building, and
Yeah.
everything that was disrupted with what was allowed to happen. And I know in the past podcasts we've done, you've described yourself as a Taoist anarchist, and I think that really greatly kind of maybe summarizes a little bit about your own spiritual beliefs along with your political beliefs. But I was hoping, maybe to, you said at the end of this book, to let us make it then a spiritual present. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how your spiritual and political philosophy, how you arrived at it, and how that sort of maybe orients you in your own daily living practices.
Oh yeah. um, Yeah, Taoist anarchist is what I summed it up. There's a last chapter of William Irwin Thompson's Coming into Being. I think it's called The Road Not Taken, where he
Mm,
articulates a Taoist planetary civilization, and I recommend folks check that out, and because I think I pretty much ascribe to it. But just looking at the themes and the qualities of the integral structure, the way Gebser articulates them, they almost seem like they're coming out of a Taoist text. There's a
mm,
sense of um, a good blend of a directive action, of ego and egolessness, of passivity in the sense of allowing things to kind of occur on their own, right? So that's a kind of Taoist and also somewhat anarchist leaning in the sense of not needing to impose too much of that hierarchical Euclidean structure, right? That the
Mm,
world is autopoietic in that sense, and that human beings can, given the right conditions, really kind of flourish without too much of. I'm not against the state, and obviously
mm.
I'm a socialist, right? But I
For all the
in my
feds listening out
utopian,
there.
yeah, yeah, in my utopian aspirations, I'm a Taoist anarchist in the sense of letting alone. There's a beautiful phrase or turn of like opening page or two of Ursula K. Le Guin's. It's not The Dispossessed, which I know is about an anarchist society, and it's great, but it's from The Lathe of Heaven, where
Mm,
she's describing a very autopoietic process of jellyfish, right? That they
mm,
basically, without needing to be able to move too much, they've survived for billions of years, and the oceans kind of carry them where they need to go. There's this kind of primordial trust in the
mm.
cosmos that I
Yes.
think the anarchist Taoist sort of leans on, and I guess I would feel the same way. But I've always had that radical streak. I mean, Kim Stanley Robinson has been a big influence for me with his sci-fi writing about politics and anarchy, and the Mars trilogy. And his most recent book, I think, is on my reading list for the Patreon this year. He's also a democratic socialist, by the way. And so was Le
Plug.
Guin. Le Guin was an anarchist,
Yeah.
very kind of radical. So I think a lot of these politics try to imagine society differently. They go, what do we really need to live under capitalism? Are there different ways to relate to structure, power, and control, which are more
Hmm.
free? Um, and just as an inquiry, I think that's a good North Star, or that's a good orientation to
Yeah.
have, you know?
Right.
Um, Even if I don't believe, we're going to abolish the state next year or something, like,
Yeah.
which I don't.
Well, I think
But
there's maybe a post-conventional anarchism that can exist because I think it's maybe important, at least for myself, that to not promote just kind of going into the Capitol and donning your furs and going ape shit. There's probably a better approach to making change in the world. But that does bring up a great section in your book where you sort of juxtaposes the primal fear and primal trust, and I think that's really important. And I'm happy you brought that up because it really connected something to me in, really trusting maybe the origin that there is something moving us like the jellyfish, toward this direction. And I know in times, at least when you're in the maybe the dark nights, it's nice to kind of find that and trust in that and understand that this too will pass and eventually you'll get there. Something I'd like to just kind of wrap this up with, Jeremy. I know you're working on a new book, and I was hoping you could share a little bit about, maybe tease what can we expect from this book, and maybe not to put too much pressure on you and your editor, but when we might be able to expect it.
sure. So I'm aiming for, realistically, for the fall of this year. And the book is called, as far as I know at the moment, it may be subject to revisions, but at the moment it's called Fragments of an Integral Futurism.
Mm,
And I would say, like, I'll tell you, because I'm still in the formative process, and it's kind of at that point where my last book was, where
mm,
I've really done like fragments of writing now, and I've done outlining, and I've done the research, and I've just been so busy with all of the other projects that are going on in my life, editorially, that I haven't had time to just sit down and let it take over my life, and that's probably coming soon.
mhm,
Um, but it's partly inspired by a few books. Obviously, William Irwin Thompson is always an inspiration. So, Coming Into Being is sort of what it's partly inspired by. Another book, or two books really, by Wilbur, Atman Project and Up from Eden, which are still some of my
nice.
favorites of his.
Mhm,
And I think they really kind of give the reader a sense of the history of consciousness, right? He spends a lot of time kind of taking us through the origins of consciousness in his stage model, and that's sort of what I'm doing with this book.
mm,
Another final or two final other books that are inspirations for it are Hillman's Revisioning Psychology,
mm.
and Ferrer's Revisioning Transpersonal
Nice.
Psychology, because it's a revision, or it's a look back at the history of consciousness from a Gebserian lens with
Mm,
contemporary research and scholarship.
mhm. Yeah.
And then it's also flipping, like that's the first part of the book. It's like, let's really look at the history of the Paleolithic and how all of the different structures are actually already kind of at play in the same way we talked about or hinted at earlier. You mentioned this, the archaic and the integral kind of being
Yeah.
intimate. Just really looking at that as our origins to give a kind of a model of what we might be able to recreate in the present or in the future, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the plasticity of the human being and human consciousness being able to move from one way of organizing society into another very
Yeah.
dynamically, sometimes within single lifetimes, as we know now in the from recent anthropology about the Paleolithic. There would be really interesting wild swings from, you know, deeply hierarchical small bands of families that would all congregate into like essentially a Burning Man for a
Yeah.
season, and then become completely non-hierarchical or
Mm-hmm.
performatively hierarchical, and then dissolve it and move to another state. And that fluidity and flexibility is a lot of what Gebser talks about with the integral structure, but I think it's also what we did in the archaic. All of the different structures are at play. And it's sort of painting the history of consciousness as one in which that fluidity and plasticity becomes sort of narrow and rigidified as we move into more contemporary times. But it also leaves us with this, I guess, a promise or a potentiality for rekindling and rediscovering that plasticity for the future. So
Yeah.
it's like, again, it's sort of like a revisioning the history of consciousness, is looking at some of the old models like Wilbur, etc., and really bringing in more of this Gebserian lens of plasticity. And then I think the subtitle of the book is probably going to be reclaiming essays on reclaiming time. So a
Mm.
lot of the book will be exploring, the latter half of the book will be exploring kind of time in late capitalism, and then integral time and how it's showing up and how it's sort of helping us reclaim this plasticity again, this
Right.
intensification of consciousness again. So it's going to be, it already has been fun writing bits and pieces of it. But it's definitely kind of me trying to step into my own writing now, with Gepser, of course, as sort of my
Right.
foundational thinker. But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So
Well,
that's sort
wonderful.
of the book in a nutshell.
Yeah, well, wonderful also section from your book. I'm not sure if you came up with it, but you talked about literary integrality, and you say, can a work, and this is referring to EPO, can a work about the integral structure also be an integral expression? I would say absolutely. I think your work qualifies. I think just speaking with you qualifies. When you talk about intensified clarity and presence coming forth, I think when talking with you, you can get that in addition to your writing, but also just speaking with you. And what makes you, I think, so unique and so influential in my own friendship with you, and just academically, is you're so accessible. And hopefully, if you can, just right now, just where can people find you, and the classes that you provide?
Awesome. And thanks, Matt. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So people can find me on Patreon. I think it's just patreon.com/Jeremy Johnson, or maybe it's Jeremy Daniel Johnson. You'll have to check. If it's
I'll
my
find the
face,
link.
it's me.
I'll find the
Yeah.
link and put it on. Yeah.
Twitter is JDJ_writes, and I have two courses coming up. If you're a German speaker, I'm doing this interesting kind of mini seminar series, which is called Seeing Through the World, with the Integral Germany Forum, and that should be fun. And I don't know what
Mm.
it's going to really look like because I've created an outline for them, but I'm like, I'm just going to show up and talk and answer questions. So I
You gotta
created
dust off
topics.
your German, though.
Yeah. There will be a translator and a facilitator who's going to help me out and field the
Nice.
questions. So that's
Mm.
interesting. I'm really looking forward to that this next month. And also next month is the English oriented Seeing Through the World course, which is a much longer, in-depth one, pre-recorded modules. People read through Ever-Present Origin, and basically we come on Zoom every other week or so and talk about it. And it's like kind of a glorified study group, but
Yeah.
it'll have some of the handrails for, like, I'll have like a read through of each of the assigned chapters. So like we get into the reads there, but that's always really fun. We have a great cohort. You've been to some of the
Yeah.
sessions, so
Yeah. They're fun.
really great group. Yeah.
Awesome.
So
Jeremy, thank you so much for being on the podcast. And I know I speak for many people. We look forward to your new book. Again, thank you so much.
thanks, Matt. It's great to talk.
Awesome.